Sometimes the past finds you when you least expect it, no matter how far you run or how deep you try to bury it. For mountain man Eli Boone, that reckoning came floating down the Bitterroot River in 1873, trapped inside a rusted iron coffin. He'd been living quiet in the Montana Territory for 20 years, with only his dog Rufus for company. One grey morning, checking his beaver traps, Eli found that coffin wedged in the driftwood. Inside wasn't a body or gold, but something worse. His dead wife's letters, her locket, and a wanted poster with his name on it. Someone had sent this coffin downriver like a message from the grave. It would force Eli to face the sins he'd tried to forget and the man he'd left for dead. But who would go to such trouble to dig up his buried past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Bitterroot River like old memories refusing to fade. Eli Boone stood knee-deep in the cold water, his weathered hands steady as he checked the beaver trap for the third time that week. At 62, his movements carried the deliberate grace of a man who'd learned that haste often led to mistakes, sometimes fatal ones. His steel-grey beard, streaked with white, caught droplets of moisture as he worked, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing in their sweep of the riverbank. Rufus, a grizzled shepherd mix with one torn ear and a limp from an old wolf encounter, sat alert on the muddy shore. The dog's amber eyes tracked every sound, every movement, every shift in the wind. In the high country, survival depended on such vigilance. Man and dog had been partners for 8 years now, ever since Eli found the wounded pup abandoned near a burned homestead. They understood each other without words, a necessity in a land where silence often meant the difference between life and death. The trap held nothing but river weeds and disappointment. Eli reset the mechanism with practiced efficiency, his calloused fingers working the metal springs despite the numbing cold. Winter would come early this year. He could feel it in his joints, in the way the aspens had already begun their golden surrender. He'd need more pelts if he planned to make it through another season in his mountain cabin. That cabin, tucked into a grove of towering pines 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, represented everything Eli valued: solitude, self-sufficiency, and distance from the complications that seemed to follow civilized men. He'd built it himself 20 years ago when he first arrived in the Montana Territory with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and secrets that weighed heavier than any pack. The structure stood solid and weatherproof, its thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, its stone chimney drawing smoke straight and true. Inside, the sparse furnishings reflected a man who needed little: a sturdy table he'd carved from pine, a rope bed with a straw mattress, shelves lined with books he'd read a dozen times each, and a gun rack holding weapons maintained with military precision. The books told stories of their own. Works by Shakespeare and Dickens sat beside practical volumes on trapping, farming, and wilderness medicine. A worn copy of Plutarch's Lives rested next to a manual on surveying techniques. These weren't the possessions of a simple mountain hermit. They belonged to a man who'd once moved in different circles, who'd known education and refinement before choosing isolation. Eli's past remained largely mystery to the folks in Cedar Falls, the frontier town that served as his occasional connection to the outside world. Every few months, he'd make the day-long ride down from his mountain retreat to trade pelts for supplies: coffee, ammunition, salt, and the few luxuries that made wilderness living bearable. The townspeople had learned not to pry. Western courtesy demanded respect for a man's privacy, especially when that man carried himself with the quiet authority that seemed to emanate from Eli's very bones. Sheriff Tom Hawkins was perhaps the only person in Cedar Falls who knew fragments of Eli's story. The two men had served together briefly during the war, though which war and in what capacity remained unspoken between them. Hawkins, a man of 50 with kind eyes and steady hands, had been elected sheriff largely because of his reputation for fairness and his ability to handle trouble without unnecessary violence. He'd never pressed Eli for details about those years, understanding that some stories were better left buried. Their friendship existed in the present, built on mutual respect and the occasional shared bottle of whiskey when Eli came to town. The sheriff often worried about his old friend's isolation. "A man needs more than books and dog companionship," he'd argued more than once. "You're still young enough to start over, Eli. Find yourself a good woman, maybe raise some children before it's too late." But Eli would just shake his head and change the subject. Some wounds never healed properly, and some losses left scars that made new connections feel like betrayals. Sarah McKenna, who ran the Copper Dollar Saloon with a firm hand and a generous heart, had her own theories about the mysterious mountain man. A widow herself at 45, she'd buried her husband during a harsh winter 5 years back and had kept his establishment running through sheer determination. She possessed the kind of practical beauty that improved with age. Auburn hair touched with silver, green eyes that could sparkle with humor or flash with anger, and a figure that work had kept strong. More than once, she'd caught herself watching for Eli's rare appearances in town, appreciating the way he treated her with old-fashioned courtesy that had become rare on the frontier. "That one's carrying a heavy load," she'd confided to Dr. James Whitmore. During one of their evening conversations, the doctor, a learned man who'd come west for his health and stayed for the challenge, nodded thoughtfully. At 60, Whitmore had seen enough of life to recognize the signs of deep grief and carefully managed guilt. "Some men punish themselves for sins only they remember," he'd observed. "The question is whether the punishment fits the crime." These three, Hawkins, McKenna, and Whitmore, formed the closest thing to friends that Eli allowed himself. They represented the civilized world he'd stepped away from, the connections he'd deemed too dangerous to pursue. Yet their presence in his life provided an anchor, a reminder that humanity still existed beyond his mountain sanctuary. The townspeople respected Eli's skills, even if they didn't understand their origin. When Mrs. Henderson's boy fell through thin ice last winter, it was Eli who'd pulled him out and administered the kind of first aid that saved the child's life. When rustlers threatened the Patterson Ranch, Eli had tracked them through terrain that would have defeated most men, leading a posse straight to their hideout with an efficiency that spoke of military training. He never asked for payment, never sought recognition, and always disappeared back to his mountain as soon as the crisis passed. But there were moments, brief glimpses that suggested depths beneath the calm surface, when something harder showed. Through Eli's careful composure, the way his hand instinctively moved to where a sidearm would hang when strangers approached, the methodical way he examined his surroundings before entering any building, the fact that he never sat with his back to a door, never fully relaxed even in friendly company. These habits belonged to a man who'd learned that danger could come from any direction, at any time. Martha's locket, hidden in a small wooden box beneath loose floorboards in his cabin, held the key to understanding Eli's self-imposed exile. The silver pendant contained a faded photograph of a woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, her face radiating the kind of joy that made even strangers smile. The inscription on the back, worn smooth by years of thumb-rubbing, read simply, "Forever yours, M." But forever had ended abruptly 23 years ago, when Martha Boone died in childbirth along with their son, leaving Eli with grief that eventually hardened into something resembling acceptance. The tragedy itself hadn't driven him to the mountains. That had come later, when grief clouded his judgment and led him down paths that still haunted his sleep. Choices made in the darkness of loss, decisions that seemed justified at the time but looked different in the harsh light of consequence. A man left for dead who probably deserved killing. Money that disappeared, questions that followed him like wolves, always circling, always patient. So Eli had come to Montana Territory to disappear, to become someone else. To let Elijah Boone die as surely as if he'd been buried beside his wife and child. The mountain man who emerged from that death was harder, more careful, but perhaps more honest than the man who'd fled civilization. He'd learned to find peace in solitude, purpose in simple survival, and a kind of redemption in the daily choice to harm no one, including himself. The seasons had passed with comforting regularity. Spring brought renewed life to the high country. Summer offered abundant hunting and fishing. Autumn painted the mountains in colors that made his heart ache with their beauty. And winter demanded the kind of focus that left little room for regret. Rufus had joined his solitary existence, bringing companionship without complication, loyalty without judgment. Together, they'd built a life that asked nothing of the world except to be left alone. But the world, as Eli was about to discover, had other plans. The iron coffin floating down the Bitterroot River represented more than a mystery. It was a summons from a past that refused to stay buried. Someone, somewhere, remembered Eli Boone. Someone had taken considerable trouble to craft a message that would reach him even in his mountain sanctuary. The careful placement of Martha's letters, her locket, and that wanted poster suggested intimate knowledge of his history, his weaknesses, his fears. As Eli finished checking his traps and prepared for the walk back to his cabin, he had no idea that his carefully constructed peace was about to shatter. The morning mist was lifting, revealing a day that looked like any other in 20 years of similar days. But by evening everything would change. The past, with all its weight and consequence, was floating downstream toward him, patient as winter, inevitable as death. The iron coffin revealed itself on Eli's fourth pass along the river bend, where flood debris from the spring melt always collected in twisted piles. What he'd initially dismissed as another fallen log now showed edges too straight, surfaces too uniform. Rufus noticed it too, his hackles rising as he approached the water's edge with the cautious gait of an animal sensing something unnatural. Eli waded deeper into the current, his boots slipping on the smooth river stones. The morning air carried the scent of pine and distant snow, but as he drew closer to the strange object, another smell reached him, the metallic tang of rust mixed with something else, something that made his stomach tighten with recognition. Death had a scent, even old death, even death contained and hidden. The coffin measured roughly 6 feet in length, its iron surface pitted with corrosion that spoke of years underwater. Heavy chain wrapped around it like a burial shroud, though the links had weakened enough that the current had shifted the whole assembly against the driftwood barrier. This wasn't some piece of mining equipment or farm machinery. The craftsmanship was too deliberate, too specific. Someone had built this container for a particular purpose. Eli's hands trembled as he worked to free the coffin from its wooden prison. The tremor wasn't from cold. He'd spent too many winters in the high country to be bothered by mountain water. This shaking came from deeper sources, from memories he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The last time he'd seen an iron coffin like this, it had been in the basement of a federal building in Kansas City, and what they'd pulled out of it had changed the course of his life forever. The chains came loose with a grinding sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Rufus whined softly, backing away from the water as his master dragged the coffin toward shore. The dog's instincts were sharp. This thing brought trouble. The kind of trouble that followed men like his master across territories and decades. On the muddy bank, Eli knelt beside the coffin and examined the latch mechanism. Simple but effective, designed to keep contents secure during transport. His fingers found the release with practiced ease, muscle memory from years he'd tried to forget. The lid opened with a screech of protesting metal, revealing an interior lined with oiled leather that had somehow remained intact despite its long journey. The contents made Eli's blood run cold. Martha's letters lay tied with blue ribbon, exactly as she'd written them during their brief courtship 25 years ago. Her handwriting flowed across the paper in the elegant script he'd memorized during lonely nights, when he'd read each word over and over, hearing her voice in every syllable. But these letters should have been destroyed in the fire that claimed their house. He'd watched them burn, along with everything else that connected him to a life he could no longer bear to remember. Beneath the letters, wrapped in silk that had somehow survived its underwater journey, lay Martha's silver locket, the one he'd given her on their wedding day, the one buried with her in the cemetery outside Lawrence, Kansas. Eli's hands shook as he opened it, revealing the photograph he knew would be there, her smiling face, young and full of hope, captured in the days before tragedy stole their future. But it was the third item that made his blood turn to ice water. A wanted poster, the paper crisp despite its impossible preservation, bearing his likeness and a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in 2 decades, Elijah Boone. The charges listed made for grim reading: murder, theft, conspiracy against the federal government. The reward offered was substantial enough to attract serious attention. Most troubling of all, the poster was dated only 3 months ago. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to gather these artifacts, to preserve them in this iron coffin, and to send them downstream to the exact spot where Eli conducted his daily routine. This wasn't coincidence. This was a message from someone who knew him intimately, someone who understood that these particular items would cut deepest into his carefully constructed defenses. Eli sat back on his heels, studying the contents while his mind raced through possibilities. The letters could have been copies, carefully forged to match Martha's hand. But the locket was impossible to duplicate. He knew every scratch, every imperfection in the silver surface. If this was really Martha's locket, then someone had violated her grave to retrieve it. The thought filled him with rage so pure it made his vision blur. The wanted poster presented different problems. If it was genuine, then someone in federal law enforcement had reopened his case. After 20 years of silence, something had prompted them to resume the hunt for Elijah Boone. But the poster could also be bait, a clever forgery designed to flush him out of hiding. Either way, it represented a threat to the peace he'd built in these mountains. Rufus approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he investigated the coffin's contents. The dog's behavior confirmed Eli's suspicions. These items carried scents of places and people from long ago, traces of a past that had somehow followed them into the present. Animals possessed instincts about such things that humans often ignored at their peril. As Eli examined the coffin more closely, he found additional clues about its origin. Scratched into the iron near the head was a symbol he recognized, a crude star with 7 points, the mark of the Pinkertons. But beneath it, someone had carved newer marks, initials that made his heart stop. J.C. Only one person in Eli's past possessed those initials and the audacity to communicate through such elaborate means: Josiah Crawford. The man Eli had left for dead in that federal building basement 23 years ago. The man whose testimony could have sent Eli to the gallows if he'd lived long enough to give it. Apparently, reports of Crawford's death had been greatly exaggerated. The implications hit Eli like physical blows. If Crawford was alive, then he'd spent over 2 decades planning this moment. The iron coffin wasn't just a message. It was a gauntlet thrown down between old enemies. Crawford was announcing his presence, his knowledge, and his intention to finish what they'd started all those years ago. But why now? Why reveal himself after so many years of apparent silence? And how had he tracked Eli to this remote corner of Montana territory? These questions burned through Eli's mind as he studied the evidence before him. Crawford had always been patient, methodical, willing to wait years for the perfect moment to strike. This elaborate delivery suggested he'd found whatever advantage he'd been seeking. Eli's hands moved automatically to repack the coffin's contents, but he stopped himself. These items represented more than evidence. They were weapons in a war he'd thought was over. Leaving them here risked discovery by others, but taking them back to his cabin meant accepting Crawford's challenge. Either choice carried consequences he wasn't prepared to face. The sound of approaching horses broke through his contemplation. Eli's head snapped up, his trained ears identifying 3 riders moving at a steady pace along the river trail. In 20 years of mountain living, he'd learned to recognize the difference between casual travelers and men with purpose. These riders had purpose. Without hesitation, Eli closed the coffin and rolled it back toward the water. The current caught it immediately, carrying it downstream toward deeper pools, where it would sink from sight. Whatever game Crawford was playing, Eli wouldn't let random travelers stumble into it. The letters, locket, and wanted poster went into his coat pocket, their weight feeling heavier than iron against his chest. Rufus had already melted into the underbrush, his shepherd instincts warning him to seek cover. Eli followed, moving with the silent efficiency that had kept him alive through campaigns most men didn't survive. From behind a screen of willows, he watched 3 riders emerge from the tree line, their eyes scanning the riverbank with professional interest. The men wore the clothes of drifters, but their horses were too good, their gear too well maintained. More tellingly, they moved with the coordinated awareness of a military unit, each man covering specific approaches while maintaining communication through subtle gestures. These weren't casual travelers. They were hunters, and Eli had a sinking certainty about what they were hunting. The lead rider dismounted and examined the muddy bank where Eli had dragged the coffin ashore. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons while their eyes swept the surrounding terrain. Professional behavior from professional men. "Tracks here," the dismounted man called out. His voice carried a slight accent that Eli couldn't place. "Recent, maybe an hour old." "One man, one dog. The coffin?" asked one of the mounted riders. "Gone. Current probably took it downstream." The tracker studied the ground more closely, but someone definitely found it. Bootprints show he knelt here for several minutes, then moved back into the brush. Eli's jaw tightened. These men knew about the coffin, which meant they were part of Crawford's elaborate scheme. The question was whether they were hunters or merely messengers. Either way, their presence confirmed his worst fears. The past had finally caught up with him. As the 3 men continued their examination of the riverbank, Eli began working his way deeper into the forest. Every instinct screamed at him to return to his cabin, to arm himself properly and prepare for whatever was coming. But 20 years of mountain wisdom counseled patience. These men would eventually move on, and hasty action would only reveal his position. The weight of Martha's locket pressed against his ribs as he moved through the familiar woods. Crawford had chosen his weapons well: memory, guilt, and the threat of exposure. But the old spymaster had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed that 20 years of mountain living had made Eli soft, that grief and isolation had dulled the skills that once made him dangerous. Crawford was about to learn how wrong he could be. The hunters would find his cabin eventually. The wanted poster would draw others, men motivated by reward money rather than personal vendetta. His carefully constructed peace was already shattered, his sanctuary compromised. But Eli Boone had survived worse odds with fewer resources. If Crawford wanted to finish their old business, he'd find his quarry ready and waiting. The game was beginning again, and this time, Eli intended to win. Eli spent the next 3 hours moving through terrain he knew better than any man alive, using game trails and hidden paths to circle back toward his cabin without crossing the main approaches. Rufus shadowed him silently, the dog's natural intelligence sharpened by years of wilderness survival. Together, they moved like ghosts through the pine forest, leaving no trail that casual observation would detect. The cabin sat exactly as he'd left it that morning, but Eli's trained eyes caught subtle differences. A jay had landed on the windowsill, its tracks clear in the thin layer of dust. Normal behavior, unless someone had recently passed close enough to disturb the bird's usual patterns. The wind chime he'd crafted from spent rifle cartridges hung motionless despite the afternoon breeze. That stillness suggested recent vibration, as if someone had brushed against the porch supports. From his position behind a massive pine trunk 50 yards away, Eli studied his home with the methodical patience of a man whose life had often depended on such observations. The hunters could have found the cabin already, could be waiting inside with weapons ready. Or his suspicions could be nothing more than paranoia sharpened by decades of careful living. The decision came when Rufus lifted his head and sniffed the air, his body language shifting to alert attention. The dog had caught a scent that didn't belong, human scent from someone who'd passed this way within the last few hours. That confirmation was enough. Eli began working his way around to the cabin's rear approach, where a root cellar door provided alternative access to his supplies. The cellar had been his first construction project upon arriving in Montana territory. Dug deep into the hillside behind the cabin, it served multiple purposes: food storage, ammunition cache, and emergency hideout if circumstances required. More importantly, it connected to the cabin's interior through a concealed passage that emerged behind his bookshelf. A man could disappear into the cellar and emerge inside his own home without being detected by watchers outside. Eli lifted the heavy wooden door with practiced silence, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness. The familiar scents of cured meat, preserved vegetables, and gun oil greeted him like old friends. He'd spent considerable effort creating this sanctuary within a sanctuary, and now its value was becoming clear. The passage to the cabin's interior required crawling through a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. 20 years ago, when he'd excavated this tunnel, he'd been leaner and more flexible. Now, at 62, the journey-tested joints stiffened by mountain winters and old injuries. But necessity drove him forward, and within minutes he emerged behind the false back of his bookshelf. The cabin's interior told its own story. Someone had indeed been here, someone who'd searched with professional thoroughness while attempting to leave no obvious traces. Books had been removed and replaced, but not quite in their original positions. The coffee tin contained fewer beans than he remembered. Most tellingly, the loose floorboard concealing Martha's original letters had been disturbed. Though the hiding place remained undiscovered, Eli's military trunk, hidden beneath his bed, showed signs of examination. The lock remained intact, but scratches around the mechanism suggested someone had considered forcing it open before deciding against such obvious vandalism. That restraint confirmed his suspicions about the intruder's identity: Crawford's people, operating under orders to gather intelligence without alerting their target. Working quickly, Eli retrieved the contents of his hidden compartments. A Colt Army revolver, maintained in perfect condition despite its age, went into his belt holster. A Spencer carbine, the same model he'd carried during the war, emerged from its wrapping along with 2 boxes of ammunition. These weapons represented more than tools. They were reminders of skills he'd hoped never to use again. The most crucial item came from the military trunk itself. Eli's fingers found the secret compartment built into the lid, revealing documents he'd kept hidden for 23 years. Letters of commendation from federal authorities, authentication papers for his work during Reconstruction, and most importantly, a presidential pardon signed by Ulysses Grant himself. The pardon was conditional, tied to his cooperation in matters of national security, but it represented his only legal protection against the charges listed on Crawford's wanted poster. As Eli studied the pardon's faded ink, memories flooded back with painful clarity. The war's end had created chaos throughout the former Confederacy, with carpetbaggers, federal agents, and local strongmen competing for power and profit. He'd served as a federal investigator, tracking corruption and violence that threatened Reconstruction efforts. The work was dangerous, requiring him to operate under false identities while gathering evidence against men who wouldn't hesitate to kill federal agents. Crawford had been his superior then, a brilliant spy master whose methods often crossed moral boundaries. Their partnership had been effective but uneasy, built on mutual respect rather than trust. The break came when Eli discovered Crawford was selling information to the same criminals they were investigating, playing all sides for personal profit while good men died following his deliberately flawed intelligence. The confrontation in that Kansas City basement had been inevitable. Crawford had tried to eliminate the only witness to his treachery, and Eli had responded with the violence his training had taught him. But apparently, his assumption of Crawford's death had been incorrect, a mistake that was now threatening everything he'd built in the Montana territory. The sound of approaching horses broke through his recollections. 2 riders this time, moving at a casual pace that suggested confidence rather than stealth. Eli moved to his window and peered through a gap in the curtains, recognizing the familiar figures of Sheriff Tom Hawkins and Dr. James Whitmore. Their presence complicated an already dangerous situation. Hawkins dismounted with the careful movements of a man feeling his age, while Whitmore remained in his saddle, surveying the cabin's surroundings with the observant eye of someone trained to notice details. Their unexpected visit could be coincidence, but Eli's experience suggested otherwise. Someone had directed them here, probably with a story designed to put his friends in danger. The knock on his door came accompanied by Hawkins' familiar voice. "Eli, you in there, old friend? Got some folks asking questions about you in town. Thought you should know." Eli considered his options rapidly. Opening the door meant revealing his presence to anyone watching the cabin. Remaining hidden risked endangering two of the few people he cared about. Crawford's game was becoming clear. Use Eli's attachments against him. Force him into impossible choices between his own safety and the welfare of others. The decision was made easier by Rufus, who began whining softly at the sound of familiar voices. The dog had no understanding of complex strategies, only simple loyalties. His friends were outside, and he wanted to greet them. Sometimes Eli reflected, simple choices were the correct ones. "Coming, Tom," he called out, moving to unbolt the door. "Just finishing some repairs." Sheriff Hawkins's weathered face showed relief as the door opened, but his expression shifted to concern as he took in Eli's appearance. The mountain man's tension was visible in his posture, his hand resting casually but purposefully near his holstered revolver. "Afternoon, Eli," Hawkins said carefully. "Mind if we come in? Got some things to discuss that might be better said private-like." Dr. Whitmore dismounted and joined them on the porch, his keen eyes noting details that a layman might miss. The physician had served as a field surgeon during the war, and he recognized the signs of a man preparing for trouble. "Certainly," Eli replied, stepping aside to admit his visitors. "Coffee's still warm, if you're interested." As the three men settled around Eli's simple table, Rufus positioning himself where he could watch all the approaches. An unspoken understanding passed between them. These weren't social calls or casual conversations. The outside world had intruded into their mountain sanctuary, bringing complications that would test old friendships and older loyalties. The weight of Martha's locket pressed against Eli's chest, a reminder that some secrets carried consequences across decades. Crawford's game was accelerating, and the stakes were rising with each move. But surrounded by the two men he trusted most in the world, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that he wouldn't have to face this challenge alone. The conversation that followed would determine whether that hope proved justified or merely another of Crawford's elaborate traps. Sheriff Hawkins accepted the coffee with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, Eli noticed, but from tension. The lawman's eyes kept drifting to the weapons Eli hadn't bothered to conceal, taking in the Spencer carbine leaning against the wall and the way his old friend's coat hung heavy with the weight of a sidearm. "Had some interesting visitors this morning," Hawkins began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man delivering bad news. "Three men, well-dressed, claiming to be federal marshals. Showed me papers that looked official enough, though something about them didn't sit right." Dr. Whitmore leaned forward, his physician's instincts alert to the undercurrents in the room. "They were asking specific questions about you, Eli, not the kind of general inquiries that usually come through. They knew details, where you live, how long you've been here, even about that time you helped with the Henderson boy." Eli's jaw tightened. Crawford's people had done their research thoroughly, probably spending weeks in Cedar Falls, gathering intelligence before making their presence known. The fact that they'd approached local law enforcement suggested confidence in their legal authority, or very convincing forgeries. "What kind of questions?" Eli asked, though he suspected he already knew the answers. "They wanted to know about your habits, your associates, whether you'd shown any suspicious behavior recently." Hawkins paused, studying his old friend's face. "They also asked about any visitors you might have had, anyone asking questions about your past." Made me wonder if there's something you haven't told me, Eli. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than Eli had hoped. He could continue the deception that had protected him for 20 years, or he could trust the two men who'd shown him genuine friendship despite his obvious secrets. The weight of Martha's locket reminded him that some lies eventually demanded a price higher than truth. "There's a lot I haven't told you, Tom," Eli admitted. "Most of it for your own protection. But it seems that choice has been taken away from me." Dr. Whitmore set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Whatever this is about, Eli, it's clearly serious. These men didn't strike me as the sort who give up easily. If you're in some kind of trouble, perhaps we can help." Eli almost smiled at that. Two middle-aged frontier professionals offering to help a man they didn't really know, against enemies they couldn't imagine. It was the kind of loyalty that made civilization possible, even in places where law existed more as aspiration than reality. "The trouble started long before I came to Montana," Eli said carefully. "During Reconstruction, I worked for the federal government, intelligence gathering mostly, tracking corruption, investigating threats to the peace process. It was dangerous work that made dangerous enemies." Hawkins nodded slowly. "That explains some things about you. The way you handle yourself, the skills you've shown. But I'm guessing the story doesn't end with a comfortable retirement. My superior was a man named Josiah Crawford. Brilliant, ruthless, and ultimately corrupt. He was selling information to the people we were supposed to be investigating. When I discovered his treachery, he tried to kill me. I defended myself, left him for dead, and disappeared into the territories." Dr. Whitmore's medical training showed in his next question. "But he didn't die, did he? That's why these men are here now." "Apparently not." Eli reached into his coat and withdrew Martha's locket, setting it on the table between them. "This morning I found an iron coffin floating in the river. Inside were personal items that should have been destroyed or buried decades ago. Crawford's calling card, you might say." Both men stared at the locket, understanding instinctively that it represented something precious and painful. Hawkins, who'd lost his own wife to fever 3 years earlier, recognized the weight of grief made tangible. "Your wife's?" the sheriff asked gently. "Martha died 25 years ago, along with our son. This locket was buried with her. For Crawford to have it means he violated her grave, turned even her memory into a weapon against me." The rage in Eli's voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakably deadly. "What does he want?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "After all these years, why surface now?" "I wish I knew." Crawford was always patient, always thinking several moves ahead. He's had decades to plan this confrontation, to choose his moment and method. The fact that he's revealing himself suggests he believes he holds all the advantages. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. These federal marshals, if that's really what they are, they'll keep asking questions. Eventually someone in town will remember something useful, point them toward this cabin. "How long do you think you have?" "Not long. Crawford's people already searched this place while I was at the river. They're probably watching us right now, waiting to see how I respond to their pressure." As if summoned by his words, Rufus lifted his head and growled softly. The dog's attention was fixed on the cabin's front window, his body language shifting to full alert. All three men froze, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the mountain environment. The whistle came from somewhere in the tree line, a bird call that was almost perfect, but not quite. Eli recognized it as a signal from his old life, a form of communication used by Crawford's operatives during their federal service. Someone was announcing their presence, probably offering to parley rather than fight. "Friends of yours?" Hawkins asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon, more like old colleagues with questionable loyalties. Eli stood and moved to the window, peering through the gap in his curtains. A single figure emerged from the forest, hands visible and empty, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying to appear non-threatening. The man was tall and lean, dressed in the practical clothes of a frontier traveler. But his boots were too good, his gear too well maintained, and he moved with the fluid economy of motion that marked professional operators. As he drew closer, Eli recognized features that had aged but remained distinctive. Thomas Kern, one of Crawford's most trusted agents during the Reconstruction years. "I know him," Eli said quietly. "Kern was a good soldier once before Crawford corrupted him. If he's here alone, he's probably carrying a message. You want us to stay?" Dr. Whitmore asked. "Witnesses might discourage any unpleasantness." Eli considered the offer, weighing the value of support against the risk to his friends. Crawford's people were professionals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate civilian complications if the situation demanded it. But they were also bound by certain rules of engagement that might protect non-combatants, at least initially. "Stay, but keep your hands visible, and let me do the talking. Kern's dangerous, but he's not a killer unless circumstances force his hand." The knock on the door came accompanied by a familiar voice. "Eli Boone." "It's Thomas Kern. Mr. Crawford would like to speak with you." No weapons, no tricks, just conversation between old professionals. Eli exchanged glances with his companions, then moved to open the door. Whatever Crawford's game might be, refusing to hear his terms would only escalate the situation. Better to understand the rules before deciding how to break them. Kern stood on the porch with the relaxed alertness of a man comfortable with violence, but not seeking it. His eyes took in the cabin's interior, noting the weapons and the presence of local officials without apparent concern. "Hello, Eli. You're looking well for a dead man. Mr. Crawford sends his regards and an invitation to conclude your unfinished business. He's waiting at the old mining camp above Copper Creek, just him and a few associates. Very civilized, very private, and if I decline his invitation..." Kern's smile was almost apologetic. "Then things become less civilized and considerably less private. Your choice, of course, but he was quite specific about preferring the peaceful option." Eli nodded slowly, understanding the implicit threat. Crawford was offering him a chance to resolve their conflict away from innocent bystanders. The alternative would be a war fought in and around Cedar Falls, with civilian casualties almost inevitable. "When?" Eli asked. "Tomorrow at noon. Come alone, but armed if it makes you feel better. This is about old business between old enemies, not some trap for a trusting fool." As Kern departed with the same casual confidence he'd displayed upon arrival, Eli found himself facing the most difficult decision of his 20 years in Montana territory. Crawford's invitation was almost certainly a trap, but refusing it would bring the fight to his doorstep, endangering everyone he'd come to care about. The weight of past choices was finally demanding its price, and Eli wasn't sure he possessed the coin to pay it. That evening, Eli sat alone in his cabin while Hawkins and Dr. Whitmore made their way back to Cedar Falls. The sheriff had wanted to stay, to provide backup for whatever confrontation was coming, but Eli had insisted on solitude. Some battles belonged to one man alone, and this was such a fight. The ghosts of his past couldn't be laid to rest by borrowed courage or well-meaning friends. Rufus lay near the fireplace, his amber eyes reflecting the dancing flames as he watched his master pace the small room. The dog sensed the tension that radiated from Eli like heat from the burning logs, understanding that change was coming whether they welcomed it or not. In 8 years together they'd faced storms, wolves, and the occasional desperate criminal, but nothing had affected Eli quite like this. Martha's locket sat open on the table beside a half-empty bottle of whiskey, her photograph catching the firelight in ways that made her seem almost alive. Eli had been staring at that image for hours, remembering details that 25 years hadn't dimmed, the way she hummed while cooking, the sound of her laughter when he told particularly bad jokes, the gentle strength in her hands when she tended his wounds after dangerous assignments. The letters from the iron coffin lay beside the locket, their pages yellowed with age, but their words still clear. Love letters written during their brief courtship, when the war was ending and the future seemed bright with possibility. She died before learning about the darker turns his career would take, before Crawford's corruption and the violent confrontation that had driven Eli into exile. In some ways, her death had saved her from witnessing his fall from grace, but Crawford's possession of these intimate artifacts represented a violation that went beyond mere criminal activity. The spymaster had deliberately desecrated Martha's memory, turning their love into ammunition for his revenge. That calculated cruelty revealed depths of malice that made peaceful resolution unlikely, perhaps impossible. Eli reached for the presidential pardon, studying its faded seal and careful script. President Grant had signed this document personally, acknowledging Eli's service and granting immunity for actions taken in pursuit of federal objectives. But pardons were political documents subject to interpretation and revision when circumstances changed. 23 years was a long time in politics, and the men who'd signed his immunity were mostly dead or forgotten. The Spencer carbine leaned against the wall within easy reach, its metal surface cleaned and oiled to perfection. Eli had maintained his weapons with religious devotion throughout his mountain years, not from paranoia, but from respect for tools that had kept him alive through impossible odds. The rifle represented more than mere firepower. It was a symbol of skills he'd hoped never to need again. A scratching at the door interrupted his brooding. Rufus raised his head but didn't growl, indicating the visitor was someone familiar rather than a threat. Eli opened the door to find Sarah McKenna standing on his porch, her green eyes reflecting concern and determination in equal measure. "Tom Hawkins told me you might need company tonight," she said simply. "Mind if I come in?" Eli stepped aside, surprised by her presence, but grateful for it. Sarah moved through his cabin with the easy confidence of a woman comfortable in any environment, taking in the weapons and documents without apparent alarm. She'd lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the signs of serious trouble. "You don't need to be here." "Sarah, this situation is likely to get dangerous, and I won't have your safety on my conscience along with everything else." She turned to face him, her expression mixing fondness with exasperation. "Eli Boone, in the 5 years I've known you, you've never asked for help with anything. You've pulled drowning children from icy rivers, tracked rustlers through blizzards, and doctored half the town through various emergencies. Maybe it's time someone returned the favor. This is different. The men I'm dealing with aren't frontier criminals or natural disasters. They're professionals trained in killing, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who gets in their way." Sarah picked up Martha's locket, examining the photograph with the gentle touch of a woman who understood loss. She was beautiful. "Tom told me a little about what happened, about why those men are here. I'm sorry someone violated her resting place to hurt you." The simple compassion in her voice nearly broke through Eli's carefully maintained control. For 20 years, he'd carried his grief alone, sharing it with no one except the mountain wilderness that had become his refuge. Sarah's understanding offered a glimpse of the connection he'd denied himself since Martha's death. "She would have hated what I became after she died," Eli said quietly. "The violence, the deception, the willingness to do whatever seemed necessary for the greater good. Maybe it's fitting that her memory is being used against me now. Or maybe," Sarah suggested, "she would have understood that grief makes people do things they later regret. The question isn't what she would think of your past, but what she would want for your future." Before Eli could respond, Rufus lifted his head and whined softly. The dog had detected something in the distance, movement through the forest that didn't match the normal patterns of wildlife. Eli moved to the window and peered into the darkness, his trained eyes picking out subtle differences in the shadows between the trees. "Someone's out there," he said quietly. "Probably watchers making sure I don't try to run before tomorrow's meeting." Sarah joined him at the window, her body warm against his arm as they stood together in the darkness. "What will you do?" "About Crawford's invitation, I mean. Accept it. The alternative is bringing this fight to Cedar Falls, and I won't risk innocent lives for my personal conflicts. Whatever Crawford wants, whatever game he's playing, it ends tomorrow one way or another. And after. Assuming you survive this confrontation, what then?" Eli had been avoiding that question all evening, but Sarah's direct inquiry demanded an honest answer. "I don't know. 20 years ago, I came to these mountains to disappear, to become someone else. That person I created, the hermit, the mountain man, he served his purpose. But I'm not sure who I'll be when this is over." Sarah turned to face him fully, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Maybe you'll be someone who doesn't have to carry all his burdens alone. Someone who can accept that other people care about what happens to him." The moments stretched between them, weighted with possibilities that neither quite dared to voice. Eli had spent so many years in isolation that the prospect of genuine connection felt both appealing and terrifying. Sarah represented everything he'd convinced himself he couldn't have: companionship, understanding, perhaps even love. A distant owl call broke the spell, but both recognized it as too perfectly timed to be natural. Crawford's watchers were communicating, probably reporting on Sarah's unexpected arrival. The knowledge that they were being observed added urgency to their conversation. "You should go," Eli said reluctantly, "before this gets more complicated than it already is." "Should," Sarah agreed. "But I'm not going to. Whatever happens tomorrow, you don't have to face it knowing you're completely alone in the world." She moved to his simple kitchen and began preparing coffee, her actions declaring her intention to stay despite the risks. Eli watched her work, marveling at the quiet courage that allowed her to insert herself into a situation that could easily turn deadly. Outside, the watchers maintained their vigil while inside. Two people who'd spent years avoiding emotional entanglements discovered that some connections transcended fear and circumstance. Neither spoke of love. It was too soon, too complicated by the shadows of the past. But something fundamental had shifted between them as the night deepened and the coffee grew cold. Eli found himself talking about Martha not as a shrine to untouchable memory, but as a woman he'd loved and lost. Sarah listened without judgment, offering the kind of understanding that comes only from personal experience with grief. When dawn finally broke over the Montana mountains, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, hope that tomorrow might bring more than just survival. The confrontation with Crawford still awaited, dangerous and unpredictable as ever. But facing it no longer felt like a solitary march toward inevitable doom. The past would always be part of him, but perhaps it didn't have to define his future. Sarah's presence had reminded him that redemption sometimes came not through dramatic gestures, but through the simple willingness to let others share the weight of living. Whatever Crawford had planned, whatever trap awaited at the old mining camp, Eli would meet it as a man with reasons to survive, rather than merely escape. That distinction might prove more important than all his weapons and experience combined. Dawn came gray and cold, with low clouds threatening snow despite the season. Eli stood on his porch, drinking coffee, while Sarah prepared a breakfast neither of them had much appetite for. The watchers had withdrawn sometime during the night, but their absence felt more ominous than their presence. Crawford was confident enough in his trap to give his quarry freedom of movement, at least temporarily. Rufus emerged from the cabin and positioned himself beside his master, the dog's intelligent eyes scanning the tree line for threats that instinct told him were still present. 8 years of partnership had taught both man and animal to trust each other's judgment about danger. And right now every nerve was singing warnings. "You're really going through with this," Sarah said, joining him on the porch with her own cup. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the methodical way he'd cleaned his weapons, checked his ammunition, and studied the hand-drawn map of the mining camp that he'd retrieved from his military trunk. Crawford won't wait forever, and every day I delay gives him more time to position his pieces. Better to force the confrontation on his timeline than let him choose the perfect moment for whatever he's planning. Sarah nodded, understanding the logic, even if she didn't like it. "What do you know about this mining camp? Anything that might give you an advantage?" Eli smiled grimly. "More than Crawford probably realizes. I helped survey that area during my first year in the territory, back when the government was still mapping mineral claims. The camp sits in a natural bowl, surrounded by steep ridges. Good defensive position if you control the high ground, perfect trap if you don't. And Crawford will control it. Almost certainly. He's had weeks to prepare, and he knows I'm coming alone. But the camp has limitations too. Only 2 ways in or out, water source that can be contaminated, and winter storage caves that connect to mine shafts. A man who knows the geography might find options that aren't immediately obvious. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in private thoughts about the day ahead. The mountains around them showed no signs of the human drama about to unfold. Eagles circled on morning thermals, deer moved cautiously through distant meadows, and the river continued its ancient conversation with the stones. Life would continue regardless of whether Eli Boone survived his appointment with the past. "There's something I need to tell you," Sarah said eventually, "about those federal marshals who visited town yesterday. I don't think they were what they claimed to be." Eli turned to study her face, noting the uncertainty in her expression. "What makes you say that?" "Small things that didn't add up. They paid for their drinks with silver coins that looked too new, too clean. Their horses had brands I didn't recognize, and the gear was all matching, not the usual mix of equipment that real travelers accumulate. Most telling, they asked questions about you that showed they already knew the answers." "You mean they were testing whether people would lie to protect me?" "Exactly. Real federal marshals would have been gathering information. These men were measuring loyalties, probably identifying potential allies or obstacles. It felt more like military reconnaissance than law enforcement. The observation confirmed Eli's suspicions about Crawford's methods. The spymaster had always been thorough in his preparations, mapping not just physical terrain, but human terrain as well. By the time he made his move, he would know exactly who might help Eli and who could be neutralized or turned. Did they seem satisfied with what they learned? Sarah's laugh held no humor. "Hard to say. Tom gave them exactly what any sheriff would, cooperation without enthusiasm. Dr. Whitmore was politely unhelpful. Most of the townspeople don't know you well enough to tell them anything useful. But they definitely got the impression that you're well regarded, that people would be upset if something happened to you, which meant Crawford now understood that harming Eli would create complications in Cedar Falls. The information could work either way, encouraging restraint to avoid drawing attention, or prompting preemptive action to eliminate potential interference. A distant sound caught both their attention, riders approaching at a steady pace along the main trail. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm before he recognized the familiar figures of Sheriff Hawkins and Dr. Whitmore. Accompanied by a third man he didn't immediately identify, the stranger rode with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the saddle, his clothes practical but well-made. As the group drew closer, Eli noted details that suggested military background, straight posture, alert eyes, and the way he positioned himself to cover his companion's flanks without appearing to do so. "Eli Boone," the stranger called out as they approached the cabin. "Name's Captain James Morrison, late of the 7th Cavalry. These gentlemen thought you might benefit from some professional consultation before your meeting today." Hawkins dismounted with obvious relief. "Found him at the telegraph office, Eli. Turns out he's been tracking the same people who are after you, just from a different direction." Morrison swung down from his horse with fluid grace, offering his hand to Eli with the directness of a career soldier. "Your friend Crawford has been a person of interest to military intelligence for several years now. We believe he's been selling information to hostile parties, Indian tribes mostly, but some foreign interests as well. What's your stake in this?" Eli asked, accepting the handshake while studying Morrison's face for signs of deception. 3 months ago, a cavalry patrol was ambushed using intelligence that could only have come from someone with access to classified movement orders. 14 good men died because someone sold them out for profit. We traced the leak back to Crawford's organization. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his medical bag in hand despite the early hour. "Captain Morrison has a proposition for you, Eli. Something that might change the odds in your favor." Morrison nodded, his expression serious. "We've been trying to get close to Crawford for months, but he's too careful, too well protected. Your meeting today represents an opportunity we can't afford to miss." Help us gather evidence of his activities, and we'll make sure you have backup when things go wrong." Eli considered the offer, weighing potential advantages against obvious risks. Military involvement would escalate the situation beyond personal vendetta, but it might also provide resources he couldn't obtain alone. More importantly, it offered a chance to strike back at the corruption that had destroyed so many lives. "What kind of evidence are you looking for? Documents, correspondence, anything that proves his connection to recent attacks on federal forces. We know he's keeping records. Men like Crawford always do, as insurance against their own people turning on them." Sarah moved closer to Eli, her presence reminding him that he had more to consider than simple revenge. "What are the risks?" To Eli, I mean not to your investigation. Morrison's honesty was refreshing. "Considerable. If Crawford suspects he's walking into a trap, he'll likely try to eliminate everyone involved. But if we can coordinate properly, time our movements right, we might catch him off guard long enough to accomplish both objectives." Eli found himself thinking about the 14 cavalrymen who died because of Crawford's treachery. Young men, probably, with families who would never know exactly why their sons and husbands hadn't come home. The parallel to his own situation was impossible to ignore. Crawford's corruption had been destroying lives for decades, and it wouldn't stop until someone put an end to it. "What do you need from me?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Mostly just be yourself. Keep Crawford talking while we position our people around the camp. If he produces any documents or makes admissions about his activities, try to remember the details. Most importantly, survive long enough for us to move in when the shooting starts. And if there's no shooting, if Crawford really just wants to talk, then you'll have learned something important about his current plans, and we'll have confirmation of his location. Either way, the mission succeeds." Hawkins looked uncomfortable with the military involvement, but his loyalty to Eli overrode his concerns about jurisdiction. "It's your choice, old friend, but having cavalry backup doesn't sound like the worst idea you've ever had." Eli glanced at Sarah, reading understanding and encouragement in her green eyes. She wouldn't try to talk him out of the confrontation, but she clearly supported anything that improved his chances of survival. "All right, Captain, but I go in alone as planned. Whatever Crawford's expecting, I don't want to disappoint him until the crucial moment." Morrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we hoped you'd say. Now let's talk about timing and signals. When this thing goes sideways, and it will go sideways, you'll want to know exactly where your friends are." As the 4 men huddled around Eli's table, spreading maps and discussing tactics, Sarah quietly began preparing supplies for the journey ahead. Food, medical kit, ammunition, the practical necessities of men heading into danger. Her presence anchored Eli to something beyond the immediate crisis, reminding him that survival was about more than winning a fight with old enemies. The trap Crawford had spent years preparing was about to be sprung, but he wasn't the only one who'd learned to think several moves ahead. Sometimes the hunter became the hunted, and sometimes patience was rewarded with justice. Today would determine which category this confrontation belonged to. The ride to Copper Creek took 3 hours through terrain that grew increasingly hostile with each mile. Eli followed game trails and old survey routes, paths that would bring him to the mining camp from an unexpected direction, while avoiding the obvious approaches that Crawford would certainly be watching. Rufus trotted alongside his horse, the dog's presence both comfort and liability. Crawford's people would recognize the animal and know its master was nearby. As they climbed toward the abandoned workings, Eli's mind replayed every detail of his conversations with Morrison and the others. Something about the cavalry captain had troubled him, a nagging sense that the man's story contained gaps or inconsistencies. Military intelligence officers were trained to be cautious with information, but Morrison had seemed almost too eager to involve himself in what should have been a civilian matter. The old mining camp occupied a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside by decades of excavation. Wooden structures, grey and weathered, clustered around the main shaft entrance like bones picked clean by time and weather. elevated platforms for ore sorting, partially collapsed bunkhouses, and a maze of equipment sheds created dozens of potential hiding places for snipers or observers. Eli positioned himself behind a screen of aspens on the ridge overlooking the camp, studying the scene through field glasses he'd carried since his army days. Nothing moved among the buildings, but that meant nothing. Crawford's people were professionals who understood concealment and patience. They could be anywhere, watching him even as he watched for them. A thin column of smoke rose from the camp's main building, suggesting recent habitation. Someone had taken the trouble to make the abandoned site temporarily livable, which implied longer-term planning than a simple meeting would require. Crawford was either very confident about the outcome of their confrontation, or he had purposes beyond settling old scores. Movement near the mine entrance caught Eli's attention, a figure emerging from the shadows to stand in plain view. Even at distance, the man's bearing was unmistakable. Josiah Crawford had aged since their last encounter, his hair gone completely white and his frame slightly stooped. But he carried himself with the same arrogant confidence that had characterized their working relationship. Eli checked his weapons one final time, then began the descent toward the camp. The Spencer carbine rode in a saddle scabbard within easy reach, while his Colt revolver sat loose in its holster. He'd positioned spare ammunition in pockets where it could be accessed quickly, and a knife in his boot provided a final option if circumstances became desperate. Rufus whined softly as they approached the camp's perimeter, sensing his master's tension and the wrongness of the situation. The dog's hackles rose, but he remained obediently at heel, trusting Eli's judgment even when his own instincts screamed warnings. "Elijah Boone," Crawford called out as Eli rode into the camp's central area. 23 years, and you look remarkably well for a dead man. Mempton Living apparently agrees with you." Eli dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible while positioning himself where he could see multiple approaches. "Josiah, you're looking surprisingly healthy for someone I left bleeding on a basement floor." Crawford's laugh held genuine amusement. "Ah, yes, that unfortunate misunderstanding. You always were direct in your methods, Eli. Unfortunately, directness without complete information can lead to embarrassing mistakes. Such as assuming I was working alone or that my activities weren't sanctioned by higher authorities." Crawford produced a leather portfolio from inside his coat, moving slowly to avoid triggering defensive responses. "I have some documents here that might interest you. Official correspondence, authorization letters, that sort of thing." Eli accepted the portfolio but didn't open it immediately. His attention focused on Crawford's movements and the subtle sounds from the surrounding buildings. Somewhere in the maze of structures, other men were positioned and waiting. The question was whether they were Crawford's people or Morrison's cavalry. "You see, my dear Eli, our entire investigation was what modern intelligence professionals call a false flag operation. The corruption we were tracking was real enough, but it was being orchestrated by Confederate sympathizers with foreign backing. My apparent betrayal was actually deep cover work, authorized at the highest levels of government." The words hit Eli like physical blows. If Crawford was telling the truth, then everything he'd believed about their conflict was wrong. The moral certainty that had sustained him through 20 years of exile would crumble, leaving him as nothing more than a criminal who'd attacked a federal agent in the line of duty. "You're lying," Eli said, but his voice lacked conviction. Crawford had always been skilled at psychological manipulation, at finding the precise words to undermine an opponent's confidence. "Open the portfolio, Eli. See for yourself." With reluctant fingers, Eli opened the leather folder and began reading the documents inside. Official letterhead, authentic-looking seals, signatures that appeared genuine. Orders authorizing Crawford to infiltrate Confederate networks by any means necessary, including the deliberate cultivation of a reputation for corruption. Commendations for successfully preventing foreign intervention in reconstruction efforts. Most damning of all, a letter expressing regret over the unfortunate attack by Agent Boone, whose patriotic instincts overcame his better judgment. The beauty of deep cover work, Crawford continued conversationally, is that even your own people don't know you're on their side. You performed exactly as expected, Eli, the righteous federal agent who couldn't tolerate corruption in his ranks. Your attack on me provided the perfect cover for my extraction from an increasingly dangerous situation. Eli's world tilted on its axis as the implications sank in. If these documents were authentic, then his entire self-image was built on false premises. He wasn't a whistleblower who'd sacrificed everything for principle. He was a fool who'd attacked the wrong man and spent decades hiding from consequences that were largely imaginary. Why tell me this now, after letting me believe I was a wanted fugitive for 23 years? Crawford's expression shifted, revealing something colder beneath the veneer of reasonableness. Because, my dear Eli, I need your particular skills for one final operation. Your reputation in this territory, your knowledge of the terrain, your contacts among the local population. All valuable assets for certain delicate work. What kind of work? The kind that requires a man with nothing left to lose, someone who's already dead to the civilized world. You see, there are still Confederate networks operating in the West, still foreign interests trying to destabilize American expansion. Your government needs someone who can operate without official sanction, someone expendable enough that his actions can be disavowed, if necessary. The truth hit Eli like a hammer blow. Crawford hadn't come to settle old scores or seek revenge. He'd come to recruit a weapon for ongoing operations, using the false guilt of their past encounter as leverage. The elaborate theater with the iron coffin, the violation of Martha's grave, the careful manipulation of evidence, all designed to keep Eli off balance and compliant. You're insane if you think I'll work for you after what you've done. What I've done. I've offered you the chance to redeem yourself, to serve your country one more time before age makes you completely useless. The alternative is considerably less pleasant. Crawford gestured toward the surrounding buildings, and armed men began emerging from concealment. Not cavalry troopers, Eli realized with sinking heart, but Crawford's operatives. Morrison's promised backup was nowhere to be seen. Either the captain had been delayed, or he'd never intended to provide support at all. You see, Eli, dead men can't refuse reasonable requests. And according to official records, Elijah Boone died 23 years ago in Kansas City. The mountain hermit who's been living in Montana territory is merely a useful fiction that can be eliminated whenever his usefulness ends. The trap was more sophisticated than Eli had imagined. Crawford hadn't just manipulated evidence and emotions. He'd created an entirely false narrative that painted himself as a patriotic agent and Eli as a deluded criminal. Whether the documents were authentic or forgeries, they provided legal justification for whatever Crawford chose to do next. But as Crawford's men moved to surround him, Eli noticed something that gave him hope. Rufus was still alert but not panicked, which suggested the dog sensed friendly forces nearby. Morrison's cavalry might be delayed, but they weren't absent. The captain had struck Eli as a competent professional who wouldn't abandon an operation because of minor setbacks. I need an answer. Eli, will you serve your country voluntarily, or must I arrange more persuasive circumstances? Eli's hand moved slowly toward his weapon, calculating angles and distances while buying time for help to arrive. Crawford had played his game masterfully, but every strategy contained weaknesses. The old spy master's greatest flaw had always been overconfidence, the belief that his manipulations were so perfect that opponents couldn't possibly outmaneuver them. Before I answer, Eli said carefully, I'd like to know one thing. If you're really a patriotic federal agent, why did you violate my wife's grave to get my attention? What possible justification could there be for that level of cruelty? Crawford's smile revealed the true nature beneath his civilized mask. Because, my dear Eli, it worked. And in our business, results are the only morality that matters. The admission confirmed everything Eli needed to know about his enemy's character. Whatever the truth about their past, Crawford was exactly the kind of man who deserved killing. The only question was whether Eli would survive long enough to accomplish it. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, while Crawford's men tightened their circle around Eli. 5 professionals. He counted, each positioned to cover specific angles of fire while maintaining clear sight lines to their target. Their discipline and coordination confirmed his suspicions about their background. These weren't hired gunmen, but trained operatives, possibly former military or federal agents recruited into Crawford's private organization. Eli's tactical mind catalogued every detail of his situation while keeping his expression neutral. The main mineshaft entrance lay 30 yards to his left, offering potential cover, but also creating a dead-end trap. Scattered equipment and wooden structures provided concealment, but little real protection against rifle fire. Most importantly, the elevated positions around the camp's perimeter remained empty as far as he could tell. Either Morrison's cavalry hadn't arrived, or they were being extremely patient about revealing themselves. "I can see you're calculating odds, Eli," Crawford observed with amusement. "Please allow me to save you the trouble. My associates are professionals with considerable experience in this sort of work. Your chances of fighting your way out are approximately 0. Especially at your age." Rufus remained alert at Eli's side, his amber eyes tracking the movements of armed men, while waiting for signals from his master. The dog's presence represented both an asset and a vulnerability. Crawford's people would hesitate to shoot an animal unnecessarily, but they wouldn't let sentiment interfere with their mission if circumstances demanded violence. "You mentioned other operations," Eli said, stalling for time while searching for any sign of approaching help. "What exactly does the government need that requires someone already dead to the civilized world?" Crawford gestured toward a wooden chair someone had placed near the camp's central fire pit. "Please sit. This conversation may take some time, and there's no reason for us to be uncomfortable while conducting business." Eli remained standing, unwilling to surrender even that small tactical advantage. "I prefer to hear bad news on my feet, as you wish." Crawford opened another portfolio, this one containing maps and what appeared to be intelligence reports. "The territories are experiencing increased activity from hostile forces, not just Indian tribes, though they remain a concern, but foreign agents working to destabilize American expansion. British interests still hope to reclaim influence west of the Mississippi, while certain Confederate elements continue their efforts to establish independent republics beyond federal control." The explanation sounded plausible enough, given the political realities of frontier life. Eli had seen evidence of such activities during his years in Montana Territory, strangers with too much money asking pointed questions about mining claims, tribal movements, and military dispositions. But Crawford's involvement suggested these operations served purposes beyond simple patriotism. "What kind of work are you talking about specifically?" "Intelligence gathering, primarily. Identifying foreign operatives, tracking weapons shipments, disrupting communication networks. Occasionally, more direct action becomes necessary when diplomatic solutions prove inadequate." Crawford's smile held no warmth. "The sort of work you performed quite effectively during Reconstruction. Before your unfortunate lapse in judgment," Eli studied the maps Crawford had displayed, recognizing several locations throughout the Montana and Wyoming territories. Red marks indicated points of suspected foreign activity, while blue notations showed federal installations and communication routes. The scope of the operation was impressive, suggesting resources and organization far beyond what a rogue agent could command. "You're asking me to become an assassin for hire. I'm offering you the chance to serve your country one final time, to redeem 23 years of self-imposed exile through meaningful service. The alternative, as I mentioned, is considerably less attractive." A distant sound caught Eli's attention, horses moving at a controlled pace through the forest below the camp. Crawford's men heard it too, their weapons shifting slightly as they prepared for potential complications. But their leader showed no concern, suggesting the approaching riders were expected rather than threatening. "Ah," Crawford said with satisfaction. Right on schedule. I believe you've already met Captain Morrison. Eli's heart sank as the cavalry officer emerged from the tree line, leading a small group of uniformed soldiers toward the mining camp. Either Morrison had been working for Crawford all along, or he'd been captured and coerced into cooperation. Either possibility eliminated Eli's last hope of external rescue. Morrison dismounted and approached the group with the bearing of a man performing unpleasant duties. His eyes met Eli's briefly, and something in that glance suggested complications beyond simple betrayal. The captain was operating under constraints that weren't immediately obvious. "Mr. Crawford," Morrison said formally, "I've completed the perimeter sweep as requested. No signs of additional federal forces in the immediate area." "Excellent, Captain. And our mutual friend here? Has he agreed to our reasonable proposition?" Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's requested additional time to consider the offer. I believe he understands the importance of making the correct decision." The exchange felt scripted, as if both men were performing roles in a larger drama. Eli studied Morrison's soldiers, noting details that confirmed his growing suspicions. Their uniforms were correct, but too clean, their equipment too uniform, their discipline too rigid for frontier cavalry. These weren't regular army troops, but specially selected operatives, probably answering to agencies that existed in the shadows between military and civilian authority. "Time is a luxury we can't afford," Crawford replied. "Recent intelligence suggests hostile activities are accelerating throughout the region. We need experienced assets in position immediately." Eli recognized the pressure tactics from his own intelligence training. Create artificial urgency to force hasty decisions. Eliminate time for careful consideration of alternatives. But Crawford's mistake was assuming that 23 years of mountain living had dulled his target's analytical abilities. "Before I give you an answer," Eli said slowly, "I'd like to understand exactly who's giving these orders. If this is really official government business, there should be documentation, authorization codes, chains of command." Crawford's expression hardened slightly. "The nature of this work requires certain flexibilities regarding normal bureaucratic procedures. National security sometimes demands actions that can't be subjected to committee review. In other words, you're operating without official sanction and hoping to present successful results as justification after the fact. I'm offering you redemption. Eli, the chance to transform 23 years of waste into meaningful service. Men our age don't receive many such opportunities." The philosophical argument carried weight, but not enough to overcome Eli's suspicions about Crawford's true motives. The elaborate manipulation, the violation of Martha's grave, the careful construction of false narratives all suggested personal rather than patriotic objectives. Crawford was pursuing his own agenda under the convenient cover of national security. Rufus suddenly raised his head, ears pricked toward sounds too faint for human detection. The dog's body language shifted to hunting mode, indicating the approach of something significant. Eli trusted his companion's instincts more than Crawford's documents or Morrison's uniforms. "I'll need to see those authorization codes before I commit to anything," Eli said, buying time while preparing for whatever Rufus had detected. Surely the government maintains some oversight over operations of this magnitude. Crawford's patience was clearly wearing thin. "You're in no position to make demands, Eli. Accept our offer voluntarily, or we'll arrange circumstances that remove your ability to choose. And if I refuse entirely, then you'll discover that dead men make very poor witnesses. Your mountain hermit persona will simply disappear. Another victim of the harsh frontier conditions that claim so many unfortunate souls." The threat was delivered with casual confidence that made it even more chilling. Crawford had clearly planned for multiple contingencies, including the elimination of anyone who proved uncooperative. Eli's survival depended on finding advantages that his enemy hadn't anticipated, the sound that made Crawford's men reach. For their weapons came from an unexpected direction, not from the forest approaches they'd been watching, but from the mine shaft behind them, A low whistle, barely audible, that could have been wind through the abandoned tunnels or a signal from someone who'd approached through underground passages. Eli smiled for the first time since entering the camp. "Josiah, I believe you may have underestimated the local terrain. These old mines connect to cave systems that stretch for miles through the mountains. Very convenient for people who know how to use them." Crawford spun toward the mine entrance just as Sheriff Tom Hawkins emerged from the shadows, his service weapon drawn and ready. Behind him came Dr. Whitmore, moving with surprising agility for a man his age, followed by 3 genuine cavalry troopers whose uniforms showed the wear of actual frontier service. "Federal Marshal Tom Hawkins," the sheriff announced, in a voice that carried clearly across the camp. "By authority of the territorial government and the United States Army, you're all under arrest for conspiracy against federal authority and violation of territorial law." The revelation that his friend held federal credentials was the final piece of a puzzle Eli hadn't realized he'd been solving. Hawkins had been more than a local sheriff, keeping watch over a suspicious mountain hermit. He'd been a federal marshal maintaining surveillance over a potential asset while protecting him from exactly the kind of operation Crawford was conducting. The standoff that followed would determine whether justice or corruption prevailed, whether the past could finally be laid to rest or would continue its destructive influence into an uncertain future. But for the first time in hours, Eli felt the odds shifting in his favor. The mining camp erupted into chaos as Crawford's operatives spun toward the new threat, their careful positioning suddenly compromised by enemies emerging from an unexpected direction. Eli threw himself sideways as gunfire exploded across the confined space, his body moving with reflexes honed by decades of survival, while his mind calculated angles and opportunities. Crawford's voice cut through the noise, commanding his men with the authority of a professional who'd survived countless similar situations. "Contain the mine entrance! Morrison, secure the prisoner." But Morrison's response wasn't what his supposed superior expected. Instead of moving toward Eli, the captain drew his sidearm and placed 2 precise shots into the nearest of Crawford's operatives. The man dropped without a sound, his rifle clattering against the wooden platform where he'd been positioned. "Sorry about the deception." "Eli," Morrison called out while seeking cover behind an ore cart, "had to maintain my cover until we could identify all of Crawford's people." Federal Marshal Morrison, working directly for Territorial Command. The revelation that both Hawkins and Morrison were federal agents explained much about how quickly help had materialized. Eli's situation had been under official observation far longer than he'd realized, probably since his first appearance in Montana Territory 20 years earlier. The government had been protecting a valuable asset while maintaining plausible deniability about his existence. Eli rolled behind, a pile of mining equipment as bullets sparked off metal and splintered wood around him. His Spencer carbine came up smoothly, muscle memory guiding his movements despite the years since he'd last fired it in anger. The first shot took down Crawford's sniper on the elevated platform, while the second forced another operative to abandon his position near the camp's main building. Dr. Whitmore moved with surprising agility for a civilian, using medical training to stay low while advancing toward wounded men on both sides. A bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but he kept moving with the determination of someone who'd seen combat before claiming his physician's bag. Crawford himself had taken cover behind the heavy wooden framework of the ore processing facility, his position offering good protection while maintaining sightlines across most of the camp. He was shouting orders to his remaining operatives, trying to coordinate their response to a tactical situation that had deteriorated rapidly. "Eli Boone," Crawford's voice carried clearly despite the gunfire. "This changes nothing. You're still a wanted fugitive, still dependent on federal protection that can be withdrawn at any moment." But Hawkins' response eliminated that threat permanently. Executive Order 847, signed yesterday by Territorial Command. full presidential pardon for Elijah Boone, along with retroactive immunity for all actions taken in federal service. You're the only fugitive here, Crawford. The news hit Eli with almost physical force. After 23 years of exile, his legal status had been resolved with a stroke of administrative authority. Whatever political considerations had kept him in limbo were apparently no longer relevant to current federal policy. Rufus had found shelter beneath an overturned mining cart, his intelligent eyes tracking the movements of armed men while staying clear of the crossfire. The dog's presence provided emotional anchor in the chaos, reminding Eli that survival meant more than just winning this particular fight. A movement in his peripheral vision warned Eli of danger from an unexpected angle. One of Crawford's operatives had worked his way around the camp's perimeter, using scattered equipment for concealment while positioning himself for a flanking attack. Eli's carbine swung toward the threat just as the man's rifle came up. Both weapons discharging simultaneously, the operative's shot went wide, disturbed by a bullet from Morrison's position that caught him center mass. Eli's round found its target as well, ensuring that particular threat wouldn't recover. 2 down, at least 3 still active, plus Crawford himself somewhere in the maze of wooden structures. "Tom, watch the mine entrance," Morrison called out. "Dr. Whitmore, stay down and keep pressure on that wound." Hawkins acknowledged with a grunt, his attention focused on preventing any of Crawford's people from escaping through the underground passages. The federal marshal moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent decades in law enforcement, his weapons steady despite the chaos surrounding them. An explosion from the direction of the main mine shaft sent debris flying across the camp, followed by the acrid smell of black powder. Someone had detonated a charge in the underground passages, probably sealing off the escape route that Crawford's people might have planned to use. "Insurance," Morrison explained grimly. "Couldn't risk them disappearing into those tunnels with all the intelligence they've gathered about federal operations." Crawford's voice rose above the diminishing gunfire, no longer commanding but desperate. "You fools don't understand what you're destroying. The networks I've built, the intelligence assets, the ongoing operations, you're crippling national security for the sake of one man's wounded pride." Eli worked his way closer to Crawford's position, using the cover of smoke and scattered equipment to approach without being detected. The old spymaster was probably armed, but had shown no inclination toward personal combat during their previous encounters. His strength lay in manipulation and planning, not in direct confrontation. "It's over." "Josiah," Eli called out as he reached a position where Crawford couldn't retreat without exposing himself to multiple fields of fire. "Surrender now, and maybe the federal authorities will be interested in what you can tell them about those foreign networks." Crawford's laugh held more desperation than humor. "Surrender? To face execution for treason? I think not, my dear Eli. If this is to be my final performance, I prefer to control the conclusion." The warning in those words sent ice through Eli's veins. Men like Crawford often prepared for capture by carrying means to avoid interrogation, whether through suicide pills or explosive devices. A cornered spy master might choose to take his enemies with him, rather than face the consequences of his actions. Movement from behind the ore processing framework confirmed Eli's fears. Crawford emerged from cover with something metallic in his hand, not a weapon, but a cylindrical device that could only be a grenade or similar explosive. His expression showed the fanatic determination of a man who decided to control his own ending. 23 years ago, you thought you'd killed me, Eli. Today, I'll return the favor with considerably more certainty about the results. But Crawford had made one crucial miscalculation. Rufus, sensing the threat to his master, burst from his hiding place with the speed and fury of a wolf protecting his pack. The dog's leap caught Crawford off balance just as he pulled the activation pin, sending both man and explosive device tumbling away from Eli's position. The explosion, when it came, was contained by the heavy wooden beams of the processing facility. Crawford's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by the crash of collapsing timber and the acrid smell of smoke and cordite. In the sudden silence that followed, Eli found himself alive and largely unharmed, surrounded by federal agents who'd been protecting him without his knowledge for longer than he'd realized. The past that had haunted him for over 2 decades was finally, truly dead, buried beneath the wreckage of Crawford's final gambit. But the cost of that victory was still being calculated as Dr. Whitmore moved among the wounded, and smoke continued to rise from the ruins of Josiah Crawford's last stand. Dust and smoke settled over the mining camp like a shroud as the survivors emerged from cover, their ears ringing from the explosion that had finally silenced Josiah Crawford's schemes. Eli found Rufus limping but alive near the collapsed ore processing facility. The dog's coat singed, but his amber eyes still bright with protective fury. The animal's courage had saved them all from Crawford's final desperate gambit. Dr. Whitmore moved methodically among the casualties, his medical training taking precedence over his wounded shoulder as he assessed injuries and administered aid. 2 of Crawford's operatives were dead, killed in the firefight, while a third would survive but required immediate surgery to remove a bullet from his lung. The doctor's calm professionalism provided stability in the aftermath of violence. Federal Marshal Hawkins emerged from the mine entrance, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. "Underground passages are sealed," he reported to Morrison. "Found evidence of a prepared escape route, along with supplies for an extended stay. Crawford planned for multiple contingencies." Morrison nodded, while examining documents scattered by the explosion. Many were damaged beyond recovery, but enough remained intact to provide insight into the scope of Crawford's operations. Maps, correspondence, financial records, evidence of a network that had been operating throughout the territories for years. "What's the full extent of it?" Eli asked, helping Dr. Whitmore bind the wounded operative's chest while keeping his own weapon within reach. Trust was still a fragile commodity, even among apparent allies. "Extensive," Morrison replied grimly. "Foreign agents, corrupted federal officials, private mercenary groups. Crawford wasn't just selling information, he was orchestrating a shadow war designed to destabilize territorial governments and delay statehood. Very profitable for certain interests, very dangerous for American expansion." Eli studied the surviving documents while processing the implications. Names he recognized from his years in Montana Territory appeared on Crawford's payroll, along with others he didn't know but suspected were significant. The corruption had spread further than anyone had imagined. "The presidential pardon Tom mentioned," Eli said carefully. "How long has that been in the works?" Hawkins smiled for the first time since the shooting started. "About 6 months. Someone in Washington finally recognized that keeping you in legal limbo served no useful purpose, while having a presidential pardon in reserve might prove valuable if circumstances required your cooperation." "You mean they've been planning to use me as bait?" "More like keeping options open," Morrison clarified. Crawford's activities had been detected, but his organization was too careful, too insulated for normal investigation techniques. Your presence in his past made you a logical pressure point, a way to force him into making mistakes. The revelation that his entire situation had been orchestrated by federal authorities was both reassuring and troubling. On one hand, it confirmed his innocence and provided legal protection he'd never expected to receive. On the other, it suggested that he'd been manipulated as thoroughly by his own government as by Crawford's schemes. Dr. Whitmore looked up from his patient, sweat beading his forehead despite the mountain air's chill. "This man needs surgery within the hour if he's going to survive. We need to get him to town immediately. Can he travel?" Morrison asked if we're careful. "But time is critical." The doctor's professional assessment carried weight that overrode other considerations. Eli found himself making decisions about former enemies, weighing justice against mercy in ways that would have been impossible during the heat of combat. The wounded operative was young, probably recruited into Crawford's organization through a combination of manipulation and genuine patriotic feeling. Killing him now would serve no purpose beyond revenge. Tom, can you organize transport? Eli asked. I'll help Dr. Whitmore stabilize him for the journey. As they worked to prepare the wounded man for evacuation, Eli noticed Morrison studying him with an expression that suggested additional complications. The federal marshal clearly had more to discuss, conversations that would determine Eli's future now that his past had been resolved. There's something else, Morrison said finally. The intelligence we've recovered here, the networks Crawford was operating, dismantling all of this will require someone with extensive knowledge of covert operations, someone who understands how these organizations function. You're asking me to finish what Crawford started, just from the other side. I'm suggesting that your experience makes you uniquely qualified to help clean up the mess he created. Strictly voluntary, of course, and with full federal backing this time. Eli considered the proposal while watching Dr. Whitmore work with quiet competence despite his own injury. 23 years of isolation in the mountains had given him peace, but it had also been a form of penance for perceived sins that apparently hadn't been sins at all. The opportunity to use his skills for genuinely constructive purposes held appeal, especially if it could prevent other families from suffering the kind of losses he'd endured. But the decision wasn't his alone anymore. Zara McKenna waited in Cedar Falls, representing possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. Friends like Hawkins and Dr. Whitmore had shown him the value of human connection, the importance of community and mutual support. Any choice about his future would have to account for those relationships. Let me think about it, Eli said finally. 23 years is a long time to spend preparing for a life you're not sure you want to live. Morrison nodded, understanding. Take whatever time you need. Crawford's network won't disappear overnight, and dismantling it properly will require patience and careful planning. As they loaded the wounded operative onto an improvised stretcher, Eli caught sight of something metallic glinting in the debris near Crawford's body. Martha's locket, somehow surviving both explosion and fire, its silver surface tarnished but intact. He retrieved it carefully, feeling the weight of memory and possibility in his palm. The locket had been Crawford's weapon against him, a tool for manipulation and psychological torture. But it could also be something else, a reminder of love that had existed, of happiness that was possible, of futures that could still be built despite the scars of the past. Rufus limped over to stand beside his master, the dog's presence a steady reminder that loyalty and companionship came in many forms. Together, they had survived Crawford's elaborate trap and emerged into a world where new choices were possible. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger questions about identity, purpose and belonging remained to be answered. For the first time in decades, Eli faced those questions not as a fugitive seeking only survival, but as a free man capable of choosing his own path forward. The mountain air carried the scent of snow, promising winter's approach and the need for careful preparation. But it also carried possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier, the chance for redemption, for useful service, for connections that might heal wounds time alone had never been able to cure. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the mining camp, Eli stood on the porch of his mountain cabin, watching the first heavy snowfall of the season transform the familiar landscape into something pristine and new. The aspens had long since shed their golden leaves, and the high country had settled into its winter silence. But the peace felt different now, earned rather than imposed, chosen rather than enforced by circumstance. Sarah McKenna emerged from the cabin carrying 2 cups of coffee, her presence in his sanctuary no longer feeling like an intrusion, but like a completion of something that had been missing for too long. She'd spent the past week helping him decide which possessions to keep and which to leave behind, a process that had proven more difficult than facing Crawford's guns. "Any regrets?" she asked, settling into the chair he'd built for her beside his own. Eli considered the question while studying the federal documents on the table between them. Morrison had been patient about receiving an answer to his recruitment offer, understanding that a man's entire life couldn't be restructured without careful thought. The intelligence work would be legitimate this time, officially sanctioned and legally protected, but it would also mean leaving the mountains that had been his refuge for 2 decades. About Crawford? None at all. About the life I'm leaving behind. He gestured toward the snow-covered peaks that had sheltered him through so many seasons. This place gave me peace when I couldn't find it anywhere else. Peace isn't a place, Eli. It's a state of mind. Something you carry with you. Sarah's wisdom came from her own experience with loss and healing. Besides, you're not really leaving it behind. We'll come back every summer, tend the cabin, check the old trap lines. This will always be here when you need it. The plural pronoun still felt strange to Eli's ears, but increasingly natural to his heart. Sarah had made it clear that his choices would include her if he wanted them to, that the partnership forming between them could weather whatever decisions he made about his future. Her quiet strength reminded him daily that love wasn't a betrayal of memory, but an affirmation of life's continuing possibilities. Rufus padded through the snow to join them on the porch, his limp from the mining camp explosion barely noticeable now. The dog had adapted to Sarah's presence with the same practical acceptance he'd shown for every other change in their routine. As long as his master was content, Rufus was prepared to follow wherever the trail might lead. Dr. Whitmore's wagon appeared on the distant trail, bringing the weekly visit that had become routine since the confrontation. The physician's shoulder had healed well, though he still favored his left arm when lifting heavy objects. His presence provided both medical care for the region and friendship for Eli, who discovered that isolation was easier to bear than genuine connection, but far less rewarding. Any word from Tom? Sarah asked as they watched the wagons approach. Morrison says the last of Crawford's network should be rounded up within the month. Amazing how quickly professional criminals lose their courage when their leader's dead and their paychecks stop. Coming. Eli's satisfaction at that news was tempered by awareness of how much damage the corruption had caused before being exposed. The federal investigation had revealed connections throughout the territorial government, from land office clerks taking bribes to facilitate fraudulent claims to territorial judges whose verdicts could be purchased for the right price. Cleaning up the mess would take years, requiring exactly the kind of patient, methodical work that Eli's experience had prepared him to handle. Dr. Whitmore climbed down from his wagon with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to respect his body's limitations. His medical bag contained not just instruments and medications, but also letters from the outside world. News of the expanding nation that Eli would soon rejoin as a legitimate citizen rather than a fugitive. "Afternoon, folks," the doctor called out. "Brought some interesting correspondence from town. Seems Washington is finally taking notice of what happened here." The letters included formal notification of Eli's presidential pardon, along with a commission as a territorial investigator reporting directly to federal authorities. The language was bureaucratic and dry, but it represented vindication that 23 years of exile hadn't been able to provide. More importantly, it offered him the chance to use his skills for purposes he could respect without reservation. Martha's locket rested in his pocket, its weight familiar but no longer painful. He'd had the photograph restored and the inscription re-engraved, transforming Crawford's weapon back into a treasured memorial. But it no longer represented an insurmountable barrier to new love or future happiness. The dead deserved remembrance, but the living deserved the chance to build something meaningful from the materials of their experience. "Sarah's agreed to marry me," Eli announced quietly, the words feeling both momentous and natural. "If that's acceptable to you folks, we thought we'd have the ceremony before we leave for territorial headquarters." Dr. Whitmore's smile was immediate and genuine. "About time, if you ask me." You've been circling each other like cautious elk all autumn. The wedding would be small, Tom Hawkins performing the ceremony in his capacity as federal marshal, Dr. Whitmore serving as witness, and perhaps a few of the townspeople from Cedar Falls who'd shown them kindness over the years. Nothing elaborate or formal, just two mature people acknowledging publicly what had grown privately between them. As the afternoon wore on and conversation drifted between practical concerns and shared memories, Eli found himself thinking about the iron coffin that had started this entire sequence of events. Crawford had intended it as a message of doom, a reminder of guilt and loss that would drive his quarry toward despair and compliance. Instead, it had become the catalyst for healing. The final confrontation that cleared away the obstacles to a genuinely new beginning. The mountains would remember him, as they remembered all who'd found shelter in their embrace. The cabin would wait through the seasons of his absence, ready to welcome him back when the demands of duty allowed respite. But Eli Boone was finally ready to rejoin the human community he'd fled so many years ago, to build something lasting with the time and opportunity that remained to him. Winter was coming to the high country, but spring would follow in its season. Life continued its ancient rhythms of loss and renewal, of endings that made room for new beginnings. After 2 decades of mere survival, Eli was ready to live again. Not as a fugitive, haunted by imaginary sins, but as a man who'd earned his peace and chosen to share it with others, worthy of that gift. The past was finally buried, and the future stretched ahead like an unmarked trail through country he'd never seen but was eager to explore.